The last photograph anyone took of Gabby Petito was on August 25th, 2021. She is standing in front of a mural in Salt Lake City, Utah. Bright colors splashed across the concrete wall behind her, afternoon sunlight catching the side of her face, a slight smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. She looks relaxed. She looks like someone exactly where she wants to be. She looks like someone on the trip of a lifetime, because that is exactly what she believed she was on. 4 days later, her fiancé drove their white Ford Transit van back across state lines, alone. He crossed into Florida without stopping to explain himself to anyone. Not to her family, not to his own friends, not to the police. He said nothing about where Gabby was, nothing about what had happened in Wyoming, nothing at all, not for days and not voluntarily, not ever. And Gabby Petito was gone. The 911 call that would eventually crack this case open did not come from her family. It did not come from law enforcement conducting a welfare check. It came from a stranger, a man passing through Moab, Utah, who had watched something happen on the side of a desert highway that he could not stop thinking about when he got home that night. He picked up the phone, dialed the emergency line, and described what he had seen through his windshield as he drove past. The dispatcher logged it, flagged it, and passed it to the responding unit. And then, for reasons that would later become one of the most scrutinized decisions in the entire investigation, scrutinized in courtrooms, in academic papers, in domestic violence training sessions across the country, the officers who arrived on scene let both people in that van drive away without making a single arrest. That call was made on August 12th, 2021. Gabby Petito would not be reported missing for another 17 days. To understand how those 17 days happened, what filled them, what was missed inside them, and what they cost, it is necessary to go back to the beginning of that summer and to understand who Gabrielle Petito was before the case made her into something else. Gabrielle Venora Petito was 22 years old in the summer of 2021. She had grown up in Blue Point, New York, a quiet waterfront community on the south shore of Long Island, the kind of place where the streets dead end at the Great South Bay, and summer smells like salt water and cut grass, and the particular sweetness of low tide in the evening. It is a neighborhood where people tend to know one another's cars in the driveway, where kids grow up riding bikes to the same deli, where the pace of life is slow enough that leaving feels like an event. Gabby left. She wanted to see everything. People who knew her described her consistently as warm, creative, and genuinely restless in the best sense of that word, not unhappy where she was, but convinced that there was more to find. She had built a small but growing presence online through a YouTube channel and an Instagram account where she documented van life, travel, the open road version of American freedom that looks luminous in a 60-second reel. She was 22, and she was building something, a brand, yes, but also a version of herself that she was excited about, a story she wanted to tell in real time. Her fiancé was Brian Laundrie, 23 years old, also from the Long Island area. He had grown up in Bayport, a town just a handful of miles from Blue Point, close enough that their childhoods occupied the same general geography, without ever quite intersecting. They had been together for several years. By 2021, they were engaged. They were living together in Northport, Florida, in the home of his parents, Christopher and Roberta Laundrie, a beige single-story house on a quiet street in a subdivision that looks like 10,000 other subdivisions in Sarasota County, the kind of neighborhood where the loudest sound on a Tuesday morning is a lawnmower 2 doors down. The plan for that summer was ambitious by any measure. A cross-country van trip from Florida to Oregon, threading through the national parks and scenic highways of the American West. Arches, Grand Teton, Yellowstone, the Columbia River Gorge. They would document every mile of it. They would post the footage. They would live the life they had been talking about building together. The white Ford Transit van, converted for full-time van living, fitted with a low platform bed, wooden storage panels along the walls, string lights strung across the ceiling, a small cooler, the organized clutter of 2 people trying to make a vehicle into a home, left Northport, Florida, in early July 2021. For the first several weeks, the trip looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. Photographs from the Red Rock country of Colorado, videos from the parking lots of Arches National Park in the heat of a Utah afternoon, a short clip of Gabby laughing at something off-camera somewhere near the Wyoming border, comments from followers accumulating beneath each post. This is goals. I want to do this someday. You two are living the dream. From the outside, looking at the feed, it looked like a love story moving west at 60 miles an hour. But something was happening inside that van that the camera never showed. Something that had been building probably for longer than the trip itself. On the morning of August 12th, 2021, the Moab City Police Department received 2 separate 911 calls within minutes of each other. Both calls described the same incident unfolding on the side of the road near the intersection of Main Street and Mill Creek Drive, not far from the entrance to Arches National Park. One caller described a man hitting a woman. Another caller, who had seen the same scene from a different angle, described the woman hitting the man. The details differed. The location was the same. Officers from the Moab City Police Department responded and located the white Ford Transit van pulled over on the shoulder, near what local records describe as the Mill Creek Drive area. Inside the van were Brian Laundrie and Gabby Petito. Both were present. Both were alive. Both were, at that moment, accessible to law enforcement in a way they would never be again. What followed was a body camera interaction that would later be watched tens of millions of times on YouTube, dissected frame by frame on Reddit, and entered into evidence in a federal civil lawsuit. Officers separated the two. Brian Laundrie was calm. He spoke to officers in an even, measured tone. He had a small cut on his left cheek and what appeared to be minor scratches on his forearm. He told the officers that things had gotten heated, that Gabby had gotten upset, that she had scratched him. He was cooperative. He smiled occasionally. He seemed, to the officers in front of him, like someone who had weathered a difficult moment and come out the other side of it. Gabby was not calm. She was crying before the officer finished his first sentence. She was shaking, visibly the kind of shaking that comes from sustained distress, rather than a single spike of adrenaline. She told the officer that she struggled with anxiety and OCD, that she sometimes got overwhelmed and couldn't control her emotions, that she had been the one who hit Brian first. She said she had scratched his face and arms. She said she was sorry. She said she just got too worked up sometimes. She apologized for being a burden to the officers. She apologized for the situation. She apologized in various forms for approximately the entire duration of the interaction. The officers made a determination. No arrests were made. The incident was classified not as a domestic violence call, but as a mental health crisis. The responding officers recommended that the couple spend the night apart. to allow things to cool down, Brian checked into the Bowen Motel in downtown Moab. Gabby remained in the van in a nearby parking area. The following morning, they were back on the road together, heading north toward Wyoming. The body camera footage would not become public for several weeks. When it did, in mid-September of 2021, the reaction from domestic violence advocates and researchers was swift and pointed. What the footage showed, they argued, was a textbook presentation of a domestic violence victim who had been so thoroughly conditioned to manage and minimize the situation that she was, in effect, doing the abuser's work for him. She blamed herself. She described herself as the aggressor. She framed her own distress as a character flaw, her anxiety, her OCD, her tendency to get worked up, rather than as a response to something being done to her. And the officers, working from what they could see and hear in that moment, took her self-assessment at face value. They saw a woman who said she was the problem, and they believed her. The Moab Police Department would later face a federal civil lawsuit over that decision. But on August 12, 2021, none of that reckoning existed yet. The van drove north out of Moab on Route 191, past the Red Cliffs and the Juniper Flats, toward the Wyoming state line. The couple continued moving through Utah and into Grand Teton country. Photographs from the Teton Range appeared on Gabby's Instagram. The jagged peaks, the Snake River, winding through the flats below, the particular blue of a high-altitude Wyoming sky in August. On August 18th, she posted a video to her Instagram account. She is sitting in the back of the van, the rear doors open onto a mountain landscape. She is talking about the wind, about how hard it is to film when everything keeps moving. She laughs at something. It is a short video, less than a minute. It is the last video she ever posted to any platform. On August 24th, according to the reconstruction that investigators would later piece together from cell records, witness accounts, and campground logs, Gabby and Brian were in the area spanning Grand Teton National Park and the Bridger-Teton National Forest. On August 25th, the photograph in front of the Salt Lake City mural was taken, though investigators would later note that the geolocation of that image and the timeline of the couple's movements raised questions that were never fully resolved. After August 25th, there is no confirmed visual record of Gabby Petito being alive. Brian Laundrie arrived back at his parents' home in Northport, Florida on September 1st, 2021. He was driving the white van. He was alone. His parents were home when he pulled into the driveway. The van sat there in the afternoon heat. No one called Gabby's family. No one contacted the Suffolk County Police Department. No one reached out to the FBI. No one said anything to anyone outside the house on that quiet Northport street. For 10 days, Brian Laundrie said nothing publicly. He did not post anything to social media. He did not reach out to Gabby's mother or her father or her step-parents. He did not offer any explanation for where Gabby was or why he had come home without her. He went, by several accounts, to a local store. He went, by his parents' later account, on a camping trip to Fort DeSoto Park with his family during the 10-day window. He was present. He was in Northport. He was saying nothing. On September 11th, 2021, exactly 10 days after Brian returned to Florida, Gabby Petito's mother, Nicole Schmidt, filed a missing persons report with the Suffolk County Police Department in Bohemia, New York. She had been trying to reach her daughter for days. The last real conversation she could place with any certainty was in late August. Since then, she had received a handful of text messages, short ones, oddly worded, not quite right in the way that a mother notices when something is not quite right. She had called, she had texted, she had reached out to Brian's phone. Nothing was coming back that made sense. She filed the report. The following day, September 12th, the case was transferred to the FBI and opened as a federal missing persons investigation. The Northport Police Department was simultaneously making contact with the Laundrie family at the house on 75th Street. Officers wanted to speak with Brian. They wanted to know where Gabby was, what had happened on the trip, when he had last seen her, what she had said. The Laundrie family directed the officers to their family attorney, Stephen Bertolino. Brian Laundrie did not come to the door. Brian Laundrie did not speak to police. His attorney issued a statement acknowledging that Brian had returned from the trip without Gabby and declining to provide any further information. That decision, legally defensible under the Fifth Amendment, constitutionally protected in every meaningful sense, became the accelerant for what happened next. Because within 48 hours of the missing persons report being filed, the Gabby Petito case had gone fully national in a way that almost no missing persons case had before it. It was on every cable news network. It was the top trend on Twitter for 3 consecutive days. Reddit threads with tens of thousands of participants were cross-referencing campground records, analyzing the metadata embedded in Instagram photographs, and mapping the van's likely route based on background details visible in posted images. People who had been at Grand Teton or Yellowstone in late August began flooding tip lines with photographs, with memories, with details about a white van they had noticed parked somewhere or a couple they had seen arguing near a trailhead. And Brian Laundrie, the last known person to have seen Gabby Petito alive, the man who had driven her van back to Florida and said nothing for 10 days, was sitting in his parents' house on 75th Street in Northport, saying nothing still. The FBI executed a search warrant on the Laundrie residence on September 20th. Agents in blue windbreakers moved through the house while neighbors watched from their driveways. They took the white Ford Transit van. They took electronic devices, phones, laptops, tablets. They cataloged and photographed. The Laundrie family attorney issued another statement. The family cooperated with the warrant, the statement said. Beyond that, no comment. But 3 days before the FBI search, on September 17th, 2021, something had already shifted. Brian Laundrie was gone. His parents told Northport police that they had not seen him since September 14th. They believed he had gone hiking in the Carlton Reserve, a 24,565-acre wilderness preserve located partly within Northport and partly within unincorporated Sarasota County. He had taken his backpack, they said. He had not come back. The FBI now had 2 missing persons, one in Wyoming and one somewhere in a Florida swamp. The search for Gabby Petito's remains and the search for Brian Laundrie were running simultaneously in 2 different states with 2 entirely different emotional registers surrounding them. In Wyoming, the investigative focus had narrowed to the Spread Creek dispersed camping area, a remote section of the Bridger Teton National Forest, accessible by a rutted dirt road off Highway 26/287, approximately 40 miles south of the town of Jackson. It is the kind of place that does not appear on most tourist maps. A flat, forested stretch along Spread Creek, where dispersed camping is permitted without a reservation, where people park their vehicles and pitch tents and generally go unnoticed. Multiple sources had placed the white van in this area during mid-August, including a travel blogger who went by the name Teton Hiker and who had posted at the time about a white Ford Transit parked at the campsite, a post that would later be identified as one of the earliest pieces of publicly available evidence about the van's location. On September 19th, 2021, 8 days after the missing persons report was filed, FBI agents working with the Teton County Sheriff's Office located human remains in the Spread Creek area. The remains were discovered approximately half a mile from the most commonly used camping spots, in a section of brush and timber that required deliberate movement off the main path to reach. They were in an advanced state of decomposition, consistent with weeks of exposure to late summer Wyoming weather, afternoon temperatures in the 70s, cold nights, afternoon thunderstorms rolling in off the Tetons. The Teton County Coroner's Office conducted the examination. On September 21st, 2021, the remains were formally identified as Gabby Petito. The cause of death was determined to be manual strangulation. The manner of death was ruled homicide. She was 22 years old. She had been dead, by the coroner's estimate, for approximately 3 to 4 weeks, meaning she had died in the last days of August, while Brian Laundrie was still making his way back across the country in the white van, while her mother was sending texts that weren't being answered, while the Instagram comments on her last post were still accumulating. The announcement transformed the character of the investigation completely. What had been a missing persons case, followed by millions, with a specific kind of anxious, hoping attention, became a homicide investigation with a named suspect who was himself missing in 24,000 acres of Florida wilderness. The Carlton Reserve search intensified dramatically. The FBI, the Northport Police Department, and the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office coordinated search teams across terrain that is genuinely hostile to that kind of work. Saw palmetto scrub so dense it grabs at clothing, cypress stands in standing water, trails that flood seasonally, and in September 2021 were still partially submerged from summer rains. Drones with thermal imaging equipment flew grid patterns over the reserve. Cadaver dogs worked the drier sections. Officers on foot moved through the brush in organized lines, marking searched areas on maps that kept growing. For weeks, they found nothing. Then, on the morning of October 20th, 2021, the search took a turn that no one had publicly anticipated. The Laundrie family attorney had announced the previous day that Brian's parents, Christopher and Roberta Laundrie, would accompany law enforcement to a specific section of the reserve near the Myakkahatchee Creek Environmental Park at the reserve's northern boundary. The family said Brian had frequented that area. They believed if he was anywhere in the reserve, it was there. The search party entered that section of the preserve in the early morning hours. The ground was wet. Water levels in that part of the reserve had been high for most of September and had only recently receded enough to make the area passable on foot. Within a few hours of beginning the search, they found a backpack. A few feet away, a notebook. And nearby, partially submerged in the shallow standing water that remained in the low-lying areas, they found human remains. The Sarasota County Medical Examiner's Office conducted the examination. Identification was made through dental records because the remains, having been submerged in warm, bacteria-rich Florida water for an extended period, were not identifiable by visual means, The remains were confirmed to be Brian Christopher Laundrie, age 23. The cause of death was determined to be a single self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The manner of death was ruled suicide. Based on the condition of the remains and the water levels in the area, investigators estimated that he had likely died in the first days after entering the reserve, possibly as early as September 14th or 15th, the same window in which his parents said they had last seen him. He had been in the flooded section of the preserve for over a month before anyone could reach him. The notebook recovered alongside the remains was damaged, soaked through, pages stuck together, ink blurred in places, but it was not destroyed. FBI forensic document examiners spent months working through it, drying and separating pages, recovering text where the water had not fully obliterated it. The process took until the summer of 2022. In August of 2022, nearly 1 year after Gabby Petito's death, the FBI released a summary of the notebook's contents. The summary was careful in its language, as FBI summaries tend to be, but its conclusion was unambiguous. Brian Laundrie had written a confession. According to the FBI's account of the document, he described the final days with Gabby in Wyoming. Her physical and emotional deterioration, her distress, her suffering. He wrote that he had ended her suffering. The specific language he used was not reproduced in the summary, but the meaning was clear. He acknowledged that he was responsible for her death. He acknowledged that he had killed her. The FBI closed its investigation into Gabby Petito's murder on the basis of that finding. There were no other suspects. There would be no trial. There would be no cross-examination of Brian Laundrie's account, no defense attorney challenging his version of events, no jury weighing the evidence. There was a water-damaged notebook written by a dead man, and the word of federal investigators who had read it and rendered their conclusion. For Gabby's family, her mother Nicole Schmidt, her father Joseph Petito, her step-parents Jim Schmidt and Tara Petito, the notebook provided something. It provided an answer to the question that had been at the center of everything since September 11th, what happened to her? But it provided that answer in the most incomplete and one-sided way that an answer can be delivered. Brian Laundrie's account of those final days in Wyoming was his account, written by him, framed by him, structured around whatever he chose to include and whatever he chose to leave out. Gabby Petito could not write her own account. She could not contest his framing. She could not describe what those final hours felt like from where she was standing. Her version of events exists only in fragments, in what she posted online, in what she said to the officers on the roadside in Moab, in what the people who loved her remember about the sound of her voice on the phone. The civil legal proceedings that followed the closure of the criminal investigation addressed two separate failures. The first was the Moab Police Department's response on August 12th. In February 2023, the Petito family filed a federal civil lawsuit against the city of Moab and the officers who had responded to the domestic disturbance call, arguing that their failure to properly identify Gabby as a victim and their decision not to arrest Brian Laundrie that evening had constituted negligence that directly contributed to her death. The lawsuit drew on the body camera footage extensively and on established domestic violence response protocols that advocates argued should have led to a different outcome on that roadside. The city of Moab and the Moab Police Department reached a settlement with the Petito family in January 2024. The financial terms included a reported payment of $1 million. The settlement also included a commitment from the Moab Police Department to implement enhanced training in domestic violence identification and victim-centered response, training that would specifically address the patterns visible in the August 12th footage: the calm abuser, the self-blaming victim, the institutional tendency to take the most composed person's account as the most accurate one. The second civil action was filed against Christopher and Roberta Laundrie. The Petito family alleged that Brian's parents had known, during the 10-day period between his return to Florida and the filing of the missing persons report, that he had harmed Gabby, and that they had actively assisted him in concealing that information, potentially including helping him plan his disappearance into the Carlton Reserve. The Laundrie family, through their attorney, denied those allegations. That lawsuit was still working its way through the courts at the time of this video, with no resolution yet reached. The case also ignited a public conversation that extended well beyond the facts of what happened to Gabby Petito specifically. The level of media attention the case received, the cable news saturation, the social media mobilization, the collaborative online investigation was extraordinary even by the standards of high-profile missing persons cases. And that extraordinary attention prompted an equally pointed question from advocates, journalists, and researchers who had been watching the coverage: why this case and not others? Wyoming, the state where Gabby was killed, has one of the highest rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the United States. The Shoshone and Arapaho nations of the Wind River Reservation, located in the western part of the state, have documented dozens of unsolved disappearances and deaths over the years, cases that received little to no national media coverage, that were investigated with far fewer resources, and that generated nothing approaching the public engagement that surrounded the Petito case. The contrast was not subtle, and it did not go unnoticed. Native American advocates, tribal leaders, and Indigenous journalists raised it loudly and specifically during the weeks that Gabby's case was dominating national headlines, and their voices were heard in a way they had not always been before. The phrase "missing white woman syndrome," a term that media critics and sociologists had been using for years to describe a documented pattern of disproportionate coverage for missing white women relative to women of color, men, and Indigenous people, entered mainstream American conversation in a new and sustained way during September 2021. News organizations that were covering the Petito case wall to wall found themselves being asked on air and in print to explain the disparity. Some of those conversations were substantive, some were defensive, but they happened, publicly and on the record, in a way that created a lasting reference point in the ongoing debate about whose disappearances are treated as emergencies and whose are treated as statistics. Several news organizations made public commitments to more equitable coverage of missing persons cases in the aftermath of the Petito case. Wyoming tribal nations used the moment of national attention to push for increased federal resources for their own missing persons investigations and for improved coordination between tribal law enforcement and state and federal agencies. Whether those commitments translated into lasting structural change is something that researchers and advocates continue to monitor and debate. The evidence is mixed. The attention, like most attention, was not permanent. Gabby Petito's family established the Gabby Petito Foundation in the months following her death. The foundation focuses on supporting victims of domestic violence, funding shelter beds, supporting legal advocacy programs, and working with law enforcement agencies on training initiatives. In interviews, Joseph Petito and Nicole Schmidt have spoken with remarkable consistency about what they want their daughter's name to mean. Not just a case, not just a tragedy that went viral. They want the story of what happened to her to function as a warning, to help someone else recognize what Gabby may not have fully recognized about her own situation, or to help someone in that person's life recognize it for them. The body camera footage from August 12th remains the most discussed single piece of evidence in the entire case, not for what it proves about the night Gabby died, but for what it shows about the weeks and months that preceded it. Gabby, sitting on the side of a Utah highway in the August heat, tears running down her face, telling a police officer that she gets too emotional, that she scratched him first, that she's the problem. It is a portrait of someone who had absorbed, deeply and completely, the language of her own victimization, who had learned to explain herself in terms that protected the person who was hurting her, who, when law enforcement showed up with the power to intervene, spent the interaction managing the situation rather than asking for help. Domestic violence researchers and trainers have used the footage in professional development contexts as an illustration of how victims frequently present in exactly this way, not as someone demanding rescue, but as someone trying to keep the peace, minimize the damage, protect their partner from consequences. The officers who responded that day were not acting with malice. They were officers making a judgment call in real time based on what they could see and what they were being told. But the judgment was wrong, and the cost of it, as it turned out, was everything. Gabby Petito would have been 24 years old at the time this video was made. She is buried in Blue Point, New York, in the waterfront community on Long Island where she grew up, where the summers smell like salt water and cut grass, where the streets end at the bay, where the people who knew her as a child still live. The white Ford Transit van was eventually returned to her family. What they did with it is their private matter. The Carlton Reserve is still open to the public. The trails near the Miakahatchee Creek section, the section where Brian Laundrie's remains were found in that shallow standing water, are accessible to anyone who wants to walk them. There is no marker, there is no sign. There is just the palmetto scrub, and the cypress, and the particular silence of a Florida wilderness preserve on a weekday morning. The Spread Creek dispersed camping area in the Bridger-Teton National Forest is still accessible by the same dirt road off Highway 26/287. People still park there and camp without reservations. The land looks the same as it did in August 2021. The same timber, the same creek, the same quality of late summer light coming through the trees at the angle that makes everything look golden and still. There is no memorial at the spot where her remains were found. There is nothing there to indicate that anything happened. The notebook Brian Laundrie wrote is in FBI evidence storage. His account of what happened in those final days is the only first-person account that will ever exist. It was written by the person who caused her death in the days or hours after he caused it, with whatever reasoning and framing and selective memory that person brought to the page. It is the last word on the subject, and it belongs entirely to him. The case is officially closed. The FBI has stated clearly that it does not believe any other individuals were involved in Gabby's death. The Moab settlement has been paid. The civil suit against the Laundrie family continues through the Florida court system. The Gabby Petito Foundation continues its work. The conversation about missing persons coverage and racial disparity continues in journalism schools and newsrooms and tribal council meetings across the country. But closed is not the same as resolved. It is not the same as fully understood. There are things about those final days in Wyoming, what was said in the last hours, what Gabby understood about what was happening to her, what she felt in the place where she died, that no notebook and no investigation and no settlement agreement will ever fully answer. The facts of the case extend to a certain point, and beyond that point, there is only the silence of a Wyoming forest in late August, and the particular kind of not knowing that the people who loved her will carry for the rest of their lives. That silence is what the case leaves behind. It is what her family lives inside of, every day, in a house on Long Island not far from the water. If this case stayed with you, and the questions it raises about who gets believed, who gets protected, and what gets missed in the space between a 911 call and a missing persons report. There is another story on this channel that follows a different kind of disappearance, one where the silence lasted not weeks, but years, where the people closest to the case kept waiting for an answer that the system kept refusing to deliver, and where the truth, when it finally came, was almost harder to accept than the waiting had been. It is there when you are ready for it.